Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome to today's workshop, where we will be kicking off work by the California Air Resources Board to decarbonize building materials pursuant to the goals outlined by Assembly Bills 43 and 2446. My name is Hanjiro Ambrose, and I'm the lead staff for building embodied carbon policy at the Air Resources Board. And this will be the first in a series of workshops on decarbonizing building materials. Today, we will focus on reporting requirements. We will discuss the motivation for this work, our planning for public engagement, background on embodied carbon in buildings, initial reporting, and baseline concepts. We will also hear a presentation from researchers at the University of California, Santa Barbara on work supported by the Air Resources Board. And I just want to let everyone know that today's webinar will be recorded and a recording will be posted to our website after today's meeting. Now, to kick us off, I want to welcome our branch chief for building decarbonization, Pamela Gupta.
Great. Thanks, Hanji. Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today as we kick off this first workshop on reducing embodied carbon in California's built environment. Once again, my name is Pamela Gupta, and I'm the branch chief of the building decarbonization work in our agency. Our team is really excited to initiate this really important effort and have lots of information to cover as part of today's workshop. Before we begin, just wanted to share a couple points to highlight the importance of this work. So the built environment accounts for nearly 40% of global carbon emissions, with a substantial portion coming from embodied carbon, basically emissions generated from the extraction, manufacturing, transportation, and installation of building materials. So tackling embodied carbon is crucial for creating a sustainable and resilient future. California has long been a leader in environmental policy, implementing groundbreaking initiatives such as California Global Warming Solutions Act, AB 32, which set the ambitious goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. The state further strengthened its commitment with Senate Bill 100, maintaining that 100% of California's electricity comes from renewable and zero carbon sources by 2045. Since buildings are a large source of greenhouse gas emissions, building decarbonization is a high priority in California's state policy. Today marks the beginning of a collaborative process of developing the state's approach for reducing carbon emissions from building materials in California. This workshop is an opportunity to share knowledge, exchange ideas, and build a robust framework that not only meets the requirements of the AB 43, it also positions California as a global leader in combating climate change. So thank you again for attending this event, and we really look forward to working together on this very important effort today and moving forward. So I'm going to hand it back to Hanji to continue the staff presentation.
Thank you, Pamela. So today in the workshop, we will be conducting a few polls to engage all our participants and gather some real-time feedback. To participate in this poll, you simply scan the QR code that you see here on the screen with your mobile device, or enter the URL that you see listed, or you can text your response to that designated number using the Poll Everywhere. There's no need to download any app. We're really excited to learn more about who is here today with us in our shared virtual space. And here we see some results rolling in. So we had well over 500 folks register for the workshop today, a lot of exciting interest and some broad interest across the industry, I see. Just give it another moment to see if a few more people can reply to our poll here, and we can get a representation of who's here. Excellent. Well, wonderful. It seems like we have some great representation here from different folks across the industry, and we appreciate your willingness to participate in these polls so we can gather some more information about who's here today. I think we're going to have some time for questions at the end of the webinar, and we appreciate you holding your questions until our public comment period. If you have any pressing needs, feel free to enter questions into the Q&A chat that that is available at the bottom of your Zoom window, and we can probably address your questions there. Great. Well, as we kick off our public workshop process today, CARB staff are looking forward to continuing to develop our plan for robust public engagement. And so briefly, we'll discuss here our plan for public engagement. Staff believes strongly that it is crucial to incorporate multiple avenues for input and feedback during the development of new regulations. Public workshops with designated comment periods like we're holding today allow stakeholders to voice their concerns and suggestions in a structured environment. Air Resources Board staff are actively developing collaborations with our sibling agencies and industry representatives. And in addition to open public comment periods on draft documents, staff are interested in engaging directly with local government, community groups, and other interested parties. Anyone here or other interested parties can feel free to email our email address at embodiedcarbon@arb.ca.gov, and we will also have staff contact information available at the end of the presentation. I want to transition now over to Aditi, who will be discussing some more background for the work today.
Awesome. Thank you, Hanjiro. Hello, I am Aditi Agarwal, a staff member of the Building Embodied Carbon Policy section at the California Air Resources Board. As mentioned before, California has long been a leader on climate and environmental policy, and reducing carbon emissions from building materials is essential in our statewide efforts to lower overall greenhouse gas emissions and achieve sustainable community goals. At the highest level, California's climate policies are determined by state legislation and executive orders. These statutes and directives establish statewide greenhouse emission targets or sector-specific goals. So in the graph, you can see the line on the left-hand side. It shows the annual greenhouse gas emissions and California's greenhouse gas emissions reduction targets all the way out to 2045. The line in the light blue shows that California achieved the 2020 target of returning to 1990 emission levels early and has stayed below that target. The 2030 target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% below 1990 levels is also described in the 2017 scoping plan update. The legislature has established two goals for 2045. One, to reduce GHG emissions to 85% of 1990 levels, and to achieve carbon neutrality, meaning that for whatever greenhouse gas sources exist in 2045, there is an equal or greater amount of natural or mechanical removals. These plans are also described in the most recent 2022 scoping plan update for achieving carbon neutrality. California's climate policy portfolio includes regulations, incentives, carbon pricing. All of this works together to ensure a robust approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So here we identify some key pieces of the portfolio approach. Because of the drastic reductions in fossil fuel consumption needed to meet the 2045 targets, there will be a dramatic benefit to not just the climate, but also to local air quality and public health. There are a range of programs to address specific sectors, including the focus of today's workshop, which is achieving a 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of building materials by 2035. The state is also in the process of developing strategies for natural and working lands, cement decarbonization, carbon capture and sequestration, and low carbon hydrogen. Finally, the state seeks to leverage state and federal funds for additional actions. Sources of funds include cap and trade programs, auction proceeds, the state general fund, the federal bipartisan infrastructure bill, and the Federal Inflation Reduction Act. Assembly Bill 32 mandates direct GHG emission reductions and air quality improvements while minimizing emissions leakage to other regions. It also emphasizes maintaining high road jobs, fostering subnational and national collaboration, and developing exportable programs for broader adoption. Additionally, Assembly Bill 32 supports cost-effective and flexible compliance to ensure widespread and sustainable participation. The key question is, what is the California Air Resources Board tasked with doing related to carbon emissions from building materials? So the two key bills here are Assembly Bills 2446 and Assembly Bill 43. They lay out the three primary goals and deadlines for our work. So the first one is to develop a framework for measuring the carbon intensity of building materials by December 2026. The second is to develop a comprehensive strategy to reduce emissions from building materials by December 2028. And finally, the goal is to achieve a 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions of building materials by 2035. These goals are codified in the Health and Safety Codes 38561.3 and 38561.6. The state has multiple emerging programs aimed at reducing the embodied carbon in buildings. CARB staff are coordinating with sibling agencies to learn how this program can build upon and support existing policies. I'm sure folks on this webinar may have heard of these policies before. For example, the Buy Clean California Act, or AB 262, applies to public works projects and requires environmental product declarations for eligible materials. An EPD is like a nutritional label, but for environmental impacts. We will cover more details about the EPD later. Another one is the Cal Green mandates for whole building life cycle assessments, which became effective in July 2024 for large non-residential and school buildings as one of the compliance pathways. CARB staff are also currently developing a net zero emission strategy for the cement sector. Globally and in California, buildings are a significant driver of GHG emissions. Worldwide, almost 40% of annual GHG emissions are attributable to buildings, with 11% alone just from the production of building materials and construction activities. Therefore, building decarbonization is a critical element of the state's plan to achieve carbon neutrality. The carbon footprint of a building is the total greenhouse gas emissions that result from all processes required to construct, operate, maintain, and deconstruct buildings. This includes the traditional fossil energy used to operate a building over its life, which we call operational carbon, as well as the materials, energy, and other inputs that go into constructing and maintaining that same building, also known as embodied carbon. Due to the range of existing policies, buildings are becoming more efficient and transitioning away from fossil fuel energy sources, reducing the overall operational carbon, such that the majority of the carbon footprint of a newly constructed building in California is embodied carbon, as shown in the two pie charts here. One important element of reducing embodied carbon is building materials. This includes the emissions associated with mining and extraction of raw materials, refining and manufacturing of raw building materials, as well as transport, installation, and the use of these building materials. While building materials are the largest source of building embodied carbon, the design of a building often dictates the types and qualities of materials required, while also establishing baseline operational energy needs. Where a building is sited also significantly impacts operational energy needs, as well as local material availability. Thus, increasing the use of low carbon building materials has the potential to reduce criteria and toxic pollutant emissions. Strategies to address construction and demolition activities can also benefit local communities. Like three legs of a stool, material selection, building design, and location are all important for determining the carbon footprint of a building. And with that, I'll hand it back to Hanjiro, who can introduce our next speaker.
Excellent. Thank you, Aditi. So CARB has developed several research contracts to support our work on decarbonizing building materials. And some of the objectives include reviewing existing and emerging low carbon technologies, low carbon design and construction practices, and global policies in this embodied carbon space to better understand the scales and sources of embodied carbon emissions associated with California's consumption of building materials, and as well the potential technology, construction, design, and policy strategies for reaching the reduction targets laid out by our enabling statutes. Today, I want to welcome Professor Eric Massenet, who is the Mellencamp Chair of Sustainability Science for Emerging Technologies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he is also a professor at the Bren School of Environmental Science and Management and the Department of Mechanical Engineering. His research lab is focused on assessing the environmental impacts of material systems and developing the data and methods for doing so. Today, he'll summarize some recent research his lab has conducted for CARB, investigating the data sources, data quality, stakeholder engagement associated with embodied carbon declarations for building materials. So I want to turn it over to Professor Massenet. Would you like to go ahead and share your screen?
Thank you, Hanjiro, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the Air Resources Board for allowing me to share some research that we're conducting in my lab at UCSB. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started. And as Aditi mentioned, and as we heard, I think in the introduction to the workshop, decarbonizing construction materials is really going to be key to net zero emissions in the future, and in particular to the climate neutrality goals of California. And we heard a statistic earlier that building materials and construction materials writ large comprise around 17% of total global energy-related greenhouse gas emissions. So that's a sizable chunk. And those emissions arise from producing the materials that go into our buildings and construction projects when they're first constructed, and then also in maintaining and retrofitting those projects over time. There are a bunch of policies, many policies that are emerging worldwide. So one of the research tasks that we have, my lab has for the Air Resources Board, is we're building a database of global buy clean and embodied carbon policies, which apply to building projects. So there are dozens of these policies that have emerged worldwide. Many of those are right here in the United States, here in California as well. But we're also seeing many policies appear elsewhere in the world, and particularly in Europe. These policies are also starting with major construction materials like concrete, steel, glass, and aluminum. And it gives policymakers around the world an opportunity to sort of learn from each other and to understand what best practices are. So we're hoping to release this database as a public resource down the line. But for now, the point is that California is part of a growing movement to tackle embodied carbon globally. And a key way that these policies work is to utilize what are known as environmental product declarations, or EPDs. So I'll introduce what EPDs are in the coming slides. And most of the research I'll discuss today was focused on understanding what is contained in current EPDs. Are there areas of improvement that could improve policies moving forward? But just to explain the importance of an EPD, it's used almost throughout the policymaking process. First, an EPD contains the data that tell us the embodied impacts of a given type of product or material. So we get a sense of which materials are important for consideration in an embodied carbon policy. The second thing that EPDs do is they provide us with the actual hard data. We get a sense of just how much embodied carbon is in a linear foot of rebar or in a cubic yard of concrete. But these data are also important for setting initial thresholds and lowering them over time. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how EPDs come to be, what the process looks like. But first, it's helpful to review some common nomenclature that's used in environmental product declarations. So these declarations have a fairly structured format for reporting. And one element of the structure is that the stages of the building life cycle are labeled with alphanumeric labels, essentially. So when we think about the production emissions, embodied emissions associated with producing a unit of steel or a unit of glass for use in a building, those are what we call cradle to gate type emissions. And you may hear that phrase in other points of today's workshop, but that refers to what are labeled as the A1 through A3 stages of the building life cycle. There's the construction stage, there's the use stage, which is the occupant stage, and then there's the end of life stage. In fact, there are impacts throughout the entire life cycle of the building. So if we were to look at A1 through C4, for example, we would call that a cradle to grave embodied carbon perspective. Most EPDs, however, in the present day for building materials refer mostly to the A1 to A3 stage. So most EPDs that are out there today are what we would call cradle to gate EPDs. What you're seeing on this slide is an example of a real world EPD. It's from a company that produces, as you see there on the screen, concrete masonry units. And if you look at the table, you get a sense of the types of data that are provided in an EPD to communicate the embodied carbon and other embodied impacts associated with the A1 through A3 or cradle to gate stage of the building life cycle. So this is the purpose of EPDs, is to contain and report those data. EPDs are subject to fairly stringent internationally adopted life cycle assessment standards. As I mentioned, most building materials include only A1 through A3, but if EPDs were to contain, and some do, if they were to contain cradle to grave data, it gives everybody a more comprehensive view of the full impacts of those materials. EPDs are also subject to a lot of checks and balances in their creation process, which I'll discuss next. A lot of third-party review, a lot of verification, and additionally, EPDs can contain a lot of information that's at the discretion of the reporter. Things like the types of plants that were used or supply chain locations that comprise the system that produced that concrete masonry unit, for example. So in our research here at UCSB, we're really trying to take stock of what are in EPDs and how are they created, and if there are strengths and weaknesses when it comes to the proliferation of embodied carbon policies. So we really asked a few questions. The first is just how up to date are the values that are reported in an EPD? Ideally, when we look at an EPD, we would like to know that those data are recent, that they're an accurate reflection of what's going on in that supply chain today. Data quality can be a big issue in any study that relates to life cycle assessment, and we wanted to get a sense of just how accurate are those data contained in an EPD. We also were curious about how often are production characteristics, so the supply chain locations, the types of technologies that are used that would give some explanatory power to the reported numbers, and what are the role of policymakers and regulators in creating EPDs in the first place. Finally, we've done a review of what the best practices are, and these are changing because embodied carbon policies are fairly new. They're evolving rapidly, and so we want to get a sense of what the best practices are that we can compile and that could be made useful to policymakers here in California, but also in other parts of the country. So I'm going to give you some of our preliminary research results. These are results that are still works in progress because the project is still underway. But I first want to start by explaining how an EPD is created. So you can see here on this slide, there are sort of several steps in the process. And it all starts with what are known as national program operators. So essentially a program operator, these are the organizations that set the reporting rules for a given product category in a given country, like steel or concrete or glass. So these are organizations that exist all around the world. There are dozens and dozens of them out there. What you see here is just a collection, a small collection of some of them from around the world. And these national program operators create what are known as product category rules. These are the reporting rules that any EPD for a given product in a given region needs to comply with. So a committee is formed, which is generally comprised of different stakeholders. Here we see manufacturers, trade associations. There are many different stakeholders who can be parts of these committees. And then they formulate the PCR. This is essentially the rule book for anyone who wants to create and publish an EPD. And you have an example here of just what's contained in a PCR. I don't have time to get into all of the details, but a lot of background information, a lot of taxonomy, a lot of definitions, and then the rules for reporting. The PCRs themselves are reviewed by another panel, which ensures that they adhere with global best practice standards, that they're clear, that they can be implemented. So that's a check and balance. And to date, there have been nearly 1,000 of these PCRs that have been published worldwide that relate to different types of materials and products in different countries in the world. So 1,000 of these have been created. And roughly, as we see here from an EPD database, roughly 180,000 EPDs have been created worldwide. So the information is vast that's out there. Of course, only a subset of EPDs will apply to a California building project. But what we wanted to do was get a sense of how these EPDs are evolving and what's contained in them by looking to the different PCRs and EPDs that are out there. And then finally, an EPD does have to be verified yet again by a third-party verifier. So again, many checks and balances in the process. So let me talk just briefly about our research. So to answer those questions that I posed earlier, we decided to focus on the materials that are currently covered by California's Buy Clean Act and also the US federal government's GSA Buy Clean program. It includes different types of steel, glass, insulation, and concrete, essentially. And we did this because we had to make the research tractable, and we wanted to focus on the materials that were most relevant to projects both in the state, but even more broadly in the United States. So we built up a database, which will also be publicly available down the line. We've processed hundreds and hundreds of EPDs. And what we did was we extracted the key information that is always reported per the rules set forward in a PCR. But we also added in some fields so that we could answer some of our research questions. So for example, do we know the locations of where the supply chain partners are located? Do we know the technologies that are installed in a plant? How clearly are data quality issues reported in a PCR? So these additional fields are also part of the database, and they allowed us to answer some of the research questions that I'll discuss next. We're also building a database of different PCRs from around the world because we want to understand, number one, are the processes for creating PCRs themselves fairly comparable, or are there important differences that policymakers need to consider when they're looking at PCRs from different program operators? And number two, we wanted to get a sense of who's at the table, who is helping to create the PCRs, with a particular interest in knowing if regulators and policymakers have had a seat at the table, because these are the entities that are really pushing the use of EPDs and PCRs forward through embodied carbon and Buy Clean policies. So let me start with our first question. How up to date are EPD data? And I apologize if this is a bit of a dense slide. We wanted to give everyone a lot of information, and you can feel free to look at the slides that have been archived online. But here what we did was we wanted to see what are the rules with respect to how recent the data need to be that are reported in an EPD. And so we reviewed the materials, we reviewed the relevant PCRs, and we found that for primary data are the data that manufacturers collect themselves. The data have to be within the last 5 years. So they can be as old as 5 years and as recent as yesterday. For secondary data, which are data that companies would get from, basically data sets or general information about their supply chains, those data can be up to 10 years old. So are these data always current? The answer is possibly no, and it depends on the type of product. So this big colorful graph that I just brought on screen gives us a sense of, if we take the embodied carbon emissions of different types of building materials and categories, as you see there to the left of the figure, and on the right side, what we see are the different colors representing the percent of embodied emissions that are attributable to the mining and extraction versus transport versus manufacturing. For products like concrete, which, I'm sorry, let me choose another one, mineral wool board, where most of the impacts are associated with the final manufacture, the A3 stage, we know that those numbers have to be at least, as 5 years old or younger, basically. But for other types of products, if we choose one like, let's say, a polymer insulation board, most of the impacts are in the A1 and A2 stage. It could be that if those are secondary data, the numbers are quite older. So it's not always the case that users of EPDs have the most accurate present-day picture of what's going on in a supply chain based on these data age rules. Now, these rules are in place because data can be scarce, it can be difficult to get the data, but it is something to consider when we use EPDs in research and for policymaking purposes. The other reason this is important is because over time, these thresholds will be ratcheted down in most embodied carbon policies. And how often those thresholds will be ratcheted down is recorded in our policy database. And we can see here that for the policies that are enacted or proposed that have communicated how often they'll reduce the thresholds, we see that they're looking to reduce thresholds every 2 years, every 3 years, every 4 years, whereas the data that are contained in EPDs could be between 5 and 10 years old, depending on the stage of the life cycle. So there could be a mismatch. It could be an area of improvement in future reporting. How clearly is data quality communicated? On the previous slide, I forgot to mention, each of the PCRs does address data quality, both in terms of age, but in terms of other indicators. And explaining data quality issues or data quality assurance is not always mandatory. In fact, it's often either encouraged or not addressed at all. So we wanted to know how often in EPDs is there an explicit treatment of data quality so that we know when we see a number, roughly how much uncertainty is associated with that number. And what you're seeing here are results that we've pulled from our database. A lot of EPDs do a reasonable job of explaining data quality, acknowledging where there are poorer data quality, and where there are better data quality. But in terms of numerical ratings, this is a way that the LCA community has to put a somewhat transparent data quality score on a given number or a given class of numbers, which are really great for interpreting uncertainty. Most EPDs don't report at that level. So we found that there's an opportunity for improving both the discussions of data quality and the numerical ratings so that all users of EPD data can have a much better sense of the potential uncertainties associated with those numbers. We also looked into how often different supply chain characteristics are reported. So the first aspect was just understanding for the producing plant or the plant that has the greatest share of embodied emissions, do we know, are they following best practices? What does their energy mix look like? What types of technologies do they have installed? And the key point with the left-hand graph is that there are think tanks and research groups who are already plotting out the necessary reductions in embodied carbon thresholds over time. But we have to recognize that to reduce the embodied carbon of any type of material, we're going to have to upgrade plants. We're going to have to switch to green energy. And those opportunities have to be rolled out over time. So getting a sense of what's installed today and what best practices mean for installations may be important for ratcheting down the threshold over time. On the right, you see an example of some technologies that have been either introduced commercially or in the pipeline for the cement sector. So having some sense of which of these are already installed and which ones might be coming in the future could also be important. But if we look to just how often we can extract specific information about the installed practices or technologies in a plant, as you see here from our database, red is no, yes is green. It's still rare that companies are reporting their production technologies, at least with some level of transparency that would suggest if they're using best practices or not. That's fairly rare, and that could be another potential area of improvement. And also the types of fuels that are being used on site. Are they renewable? Is it coal? Is it natural gas? This visibility isn't there as well. And what that means is we don't quite understand when we see a collection of EPD data what explains the ones that are low versus what explains the ones that are high. I saw in the questions earlier that someone was asking about, what about environmental co-benefits? Are there human health protections or other pollutant reduction emissions that could be achieved through lowering embodied carbon? So the first thing we did was to take a look at, are there relationships between embodied carbon and other embodied impacts that lead to, for example, acid rain or local human health effects? These are some preliminary results for acid rain or acidification potential. And yes, it's somewhat intuitive that when we move to lower carbon fuels or have lower embodied carbon, we also lower air pollution. So we wanted to know, are companies reporting the locations of supply chain partners, logistics, that sort of thing, so that if embodied carbon were to be lowered over time, would we also be able to seize the environmental co-benefits and where and which specific communities? However, that sort of transparency is rarely contained in EPDs. The good news is that EPDs are growing. There are more and more coming out all the time, and that there's a growing movement towards developing best practices. So all of those, let's say, gaps or or areas of opportunity I just described from our research are things that could be done to improve EPDs to make them even more useful to policymaking moving forward. And the US EPA here in the United States has a big effort that is bringing together different stakeholders to develop best practices for EPDs in terms of data quality, phase one, how thresholds are set, number two, and then even labeling programs so that these best practices can proliferate and we can all have greater confidence that the policies are working to their fullest extent. And one key component of this is that there are data quality assessment methods that are being recommended at the federal level, which could be adopted in other jurisdictions that will sort of institutionalize a universal way of scoring data quality. So that would address one of the key opportunity areas that we found in our research. And lastly, to take a step back and talk about who develops the PCRs. This is a work in progress. We've reviewed dozens and dozens of PCRs, both domestic and coming from other countries, key import partners of California and the United States. On the slide, you see some of the program operators we've reviewed, some of the products we've reviewed, and the net message here is that in developing the rules for publishing EPDs, there historically have been a lot of LCA consultants, which is great because it involves LCA, a lot of manufacturers, which is great, we need them at the table, a lot of trade association members, academics like me, but policymakers and regulators are rarely at the table when it comes to informing the PCRs, which will ultimately inform EPDs. And that could be an opportunity moving forward because now policymakers and regulators are really the ones who are accelerating the adoption of these programs worldwide. So that's an opportunity for greater stakeholder engagement. So to summarize, these policies are proliferating globally, also right here in California. There are many PCRs and EPDs out there, but they still have some improvement opportunities, many benefits, but some improvement opportunities. The coverage of different materials is still somewhat incomplete. So there's been a lot of focus on a smaller subset of materials. For good reason, they comprise a lot of embodied carbon. But we found that both their processes and their contents had some room for improvement to make them even a more powerful policy resource. And those efforts are underway right here in the US and elsewhere in the world to improve data quality ratings, to make them more transparent and comparable. And just to summarize, what we see from our research, at least, as key remaining opportunities include making sure that there's comparability in the consistency and the requirements and the reporting boundaries across PCRs, making sure that there could be more transparency in what production characteristics and supply chain characteristics are reported, involving more stakeholders, and ideally making the data a bit more timely because data can be somewhat old and still be valid for use, but we're looking at a snapshot potentially of somewhat old data and not necessarily what's happening, in the present day in our supply chains. So with that, I thank you for your time, and you can find the slides online, and I'll turn it back over to the workshop moderators.
Thank you very much, Professor Massenet. That was an excellent presentation. And as you said, we have the slides available on our website. Obviously, this is some work that the Air Resources Board is supporting. So these reports will eventually be made public as well. And we'll have a Q&A session at the end and welcome any feedback or questions at that time. Great. So we're going to turn back for a moment here to talk about our reporting requirements. So as Aditi mentioned, our enabling statutes lay out three primary goals and deadlines. Our program is tasked with an aggressive timeline to create a reporting framework, set an emissions baseline, and develop a strategy to achieve a 40% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from building materials by 2035, as illustrated on this slide. Our most immediate task is to conduct a public process to develop our reporting and reporting fee requirements. Existing and proposed greenhouse gas reporting programs could play a crucial role in supporting measures to reduce carbon emissions from buildings and building materials. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency has a greenhouse gas reporting program which tracks emissions from many large facilities nationwide. And while the Air Resources Board the Air Resources Board's mandatory program for greenhouse gas reporting focuses on facilities within California. Looking forward, recent Senate bills 253 and 261 aimed to mandate disclosure of Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions for large companies that do business in California, which could also inform understanding and management of carbon flows related to buildings. Next slide, please. Our statute lays out 5 key reporting requirements, which I'll discuss here. First, entities undertaking construction projects must submit a life cycle assessment. A life cycle assessment is a standardized method for analyzing the environmental impacts of products. Manufacturers must also provide environmental product declarations, or EPDs, which were discussed by Professor Massenet. EPDs are publicly disclosed outputs of life cycle assessments. EPDs generally report a small range of environmental impact indicators, not just greenhouse gases, which is important for avoiding potential trade-offs or shifts in local environmental impacts. CARB is also permitted to assess a fee to cover administrative costs of reporting. CARB must also be able to evaluate the cost and feasibility of implementing any strategy which the agency develops. And finally, manufacturers are also required to report any underlying data that is required to ensure that we have met our targets. Now, environmental product declarations, EPDs, have primarily evolved through voluntary reporting systems. And while EPDs provide a robust technical foundation for environmental disclosures and reporting, as we heard from Professor Massenet, there are currently a significant number of data gaps and scope limitations that limit the overall effectiveness of many EPDs currently in the market. Measuring, reporting, and verifying emissions will be crucial to ensuring that this program yields actual emissions reductions, actual greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The Air Resources Board will need to collect detailed background environmental product declaration data to ensure that the quality of EPDs and also inform the foundations of this program. Overall, we are aiming to develop reporting requirements that address these key data gaps while also being responsive to reporting burdens and existing reporting requirements. So we have another interactive poll for everyone, this time interested in gaining some more information on your familiarity with environmental product declarations. Once again, simply scan the QR code that appears on the slide with your mobile device or text your responses to the designated number using the poll anywhere, using poll everywhere. You do not need to download an app. So here we're asking about your familiarity with the EPG generation process, and also your confidence or thoughts on the estimates of emissions from EPDs. Just wait for a few more seconds for last responses to trickle in. But I think immediately that this is a pretty revealing for everyone here today, as well as our staff and other agencies, that there is a lot of work to be done on probably increasing familiarity with the EPD generation and creation process. And obviously, there are going to be folks who have yet to encounter environmental product declarations or work with them. Can we move on to the next result, please? So here's our second question about how you feel about EPDs being used to determine carbon emissions. Interesting to see somewhat of a plurality of support. for using EPDs, but an awareness that they perhaps have some room to go. Excellent. Thank you so much for participating in those polls. I think these results are very informative for us and hopefully as well folks who are here today. So in addition to this polling, we'd also like to request your insights on a few additional questions related to environmental product declarations. Specifically, we're interested in understanding the major barriers that you encounter in creating or generating environmental product declarations. We'd also be interested in hearing your suggestions for overcoming these limitations. We're open to exploring other data or resources that might achieve the same objectives as environmental product declarations, but would appreciate any recommendations you have on this front. And lastly, we are keen to identify any existing regulatory data reporting requirements that could be leveraged to streamline our efforts and reduce any reporting burdens or redundancies. Your feedback is crucial in helping us enhance our process and achieve our goals. As I spoke to earlier, statute outlines distinct reporting requirements for entities undertaking construction projects and manufacturers. Manufacturers are required to provide environmental product declarations in addition to reporting underlying data needed to understand the feasibility or to ensure compliance with targets. At the building level, CARB will need data on both construction processes and the actual materials used in buildings to quantify progress towards reduction targets. Entities undertaking construction projects will need to submit life cycle assessment information to analyze environmental impacts of their products. Measuring, reporting, and verifying emissions will be critical to ensuring that this program yields actual reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. And while statute clearly lays out reporting objectives and obligations, staff at the Air Resources Board are very interested in soliciting more public feedback on reporting opportunities and barriers. This includes information regarding the most efficient or effective points in the life cycle of new building construction to collect data, and which stakeholders should be involved in reporting or have the data. As we develop a new reporting system and set of requirements for reducing carbon emissions associated with building materials and new buildings, your feedback is crucial. We want to understand if there are standardized methods that your firms already use to collect, share, or report data. Additionally, we're very interested in how CARB can best design our data reporting systems to leverage the existing data collection practices you have in place. Lastly, we need to identify which types of data are most difficult to track and report so we can address these challenges effectively. Staff have developed a brief survey to better understand industry trends, which we are disseminating to industry partners, and we appreciate the opportunity to work with your organization on developing our approach. Moving forward, we also need your input on the topic of collecting data required to evaluate the cost and feasibility of strategies. As we discussed, statute requires us to evaluate the cost impacts and feasibility of implementing our strategy. We are seeking your advice on the best approaches CARB should use to collect cost data while respecting confidentiality and proprietary business information. Additionally, we want to understand which methodologies you believe are most appropriate for evaluating cost impacts. Please note that we will continue to explore feasibility considerations in our future workshops. Your feedback will be instrumental to shaping our approach. Now, we're going to pivot slightly and seek some input on some initial concepts for developing a baseline for reducing embodied carbon emissions, reducing emissions from building materials. And for that discussion, I'm going to pass it back over to Aditi.
Great. Thank you, Hanjiro. So our enabling statute requires us to develop a baseline for embodied carbon emissions prior to implementing compliance requirements. The baseline would represent an initial estimate of greenhouse gas emissions from which the 40% reduction target is assessed. This slide further illustrates the process of establishing an emissions baseline. So there are two key elements. First, we need to estimate the total amount of building materials used in California, quantified in units. And second, we must account for the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of these materials measured in kilograms of CO2 equivalent per unit. By multiplying these two factors, we can establish a comprehensive baseline of greenhouse gas emissions for building materials used in the state. Air Resources Board staff are currently exploring potential methods for developing a GHG emissions baseline. One option is a top-down approach, which involves using aggregated data to estimate total emissions. Alternatively, there's a bottom-up approach, which would compile detailed data from individual projects and materials to build a more granular baseline. The top-down approach involves estimating baseline greenhouse gas emissions by examining industrial output, such as total dollars of product sold per sector, and attributing emissions at the industrial output level. For example, at the level of North American industry classifications. By using aggregated data on the total production of building materials, we can estimate the associated emissions across the industry. This method provides a broad overview of emissions, helping us establish an initial baseline from which to measure reductions. The bottom-up approach involves conducting a detailed survey of buildings and construction projects to gather specific data. This process includes estimating the quantities of materials used and attributing their respective emissions based on life cycle assessments. By scaling these project-level findings, we can aggregate the data to create a comprehensive baseline of greenhouse gas emissions. This method might provide a more detailed view of emissions, but presents some trade-offs. As you can imagine, any approach for developing a GHG emissions baseline will have both strengths and weaknesses. The top-down approach benefits from widely available data and can capture most of the relevant emissions, providing a broad overview. However, it offers limited specificity for individual actors seeking to reduce their emissions, making it less useful for detailed analyses. On the other hand, the bottom-up approach provides high-resolution detail for specific projects and allows for targeted analysis of individual entities. Despite these advantages, it is difficult to generalize the results from a smaller sample of projects to an aggregate population, and this approach is data greedy, meaning it requires significant effort and expense to collect all the necessary data. Understanding these trade-offs will help us choose the most effective method for our goals. We are very interested in learning more about your perspectives on how to address data limitations for both approaches, the bottom-up and the top-down, used for assessing greenhouse gas emissions. Do you find one of these baseline development approaches preferable over the other? If so, why? Additionally, what other factors should Air Resources Board consider when developing these baselines to ensure accuracy and comprehensiveness? We're also interested in learning if there is an existing information or data source that we could rely on to help set these baselines more effectively. Your insight and suggestions are invaluable in guiding our approach and improving our methods. We are seeking to better understand market trends for key building materials as we develop our reporting framework. Partnering with the Air Resources Board for early data sharing and engagement will allow interested parties to play a crucial role in shaping the system design. By contributing data voluntarily, you can help us identify and address potential hurdles and reduce costs associated with reporting. This collaborative approach will ensure that the reporting framework is both effective and practical for all stakeholders. We invite companies interested in voluntary data reporting to join us in this important initiative. To summarize, our core requests for information from attendees today, we are seeking your input on approaches to data reporting, particularly in the context of embodied carbon. Are you interested in working early with the Air Resources Board to help define key aspects of our reporting tool development? Your early engagement can significantly influence the design and functionality of these tools, making them more user-friendly and effective. Additionally, we need your input to help inform the methodology used for baseline development, ensuring it is both accurate and comprehensive. Your expertise and feedback are invaluable in shaping a robust and practical reporting framework. We look forward to your active participation and collaboration in this important initiative. We really want to hear from you and would like to open this up to a question and answer session, for which I'll hand it over to my colleague, Alexander.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Aditi. So we are going to begin a question and answer session. There's two ways to do this. You are welcome to raise your hand, and then we will call on you to briefly ask your question in the meeting, or you are welcome to type your question into the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen on Zoom, and we can also read your question there and then have it answered out loud. With that, I think we can go ahead and begin. Let's see, we have a few hands raised. I'm just going to start calling on people in the order that you raised them. Let's see. Arzo, I hope I pronounced that correctly. I am setting it to allow you to talk. So if you would like to ask your question, try to keep it brief within 2 minutes. We will do our best to answer it here in the workshop.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. My question is for modular or off-site delivery, which has been recently proved, comes with carbon reduction emission, and among the items that you put for core requests for information from interested parties, how would you see that if I want to frame it in a broader term, the type of construction, how the type of construction impact the carbon emission reduction? Thank you.
I'm sorry, Handro, it looks like you are hopping in.
Yeah, I didn't quite hear the question in that that comment, but just so everyone knows, we some comments today we might not be ready to we might not have a reply for, but we're very excited to take in your feedback. If you have feedback that you'd like to provide today on questions we raised in the meeting, please, excited to hear that through this Q&A session or this public comment period right now. Additionally, we will be accepting, we're interested in reviewing any written comments as well we receive in response to these questions. Arzu, I don't know if you want to try again to rephrase that, but unfortunately I wasn't able to hear a specific
Sure,
question.
I try again. Thank you so much. How construction method may impact the carbon emission reduction? Speaking of the impact of modular or off-site construction delivery, may reduce the carbon emission because it's reduced the construction schedule, it reduced the transportation cost, reduced the cost or emission associated with the labor hours. And it's been published and proven that CAN has the potential to reduce carbon emissions. So if I put that in a phrase, I would say that construction techniques has the potential to impact the carbon emission. It's something you may want to consider including in in the agenda for the future references. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we will take that into consideration. We definitely are thinking about modular construction and perhaps focusing part or entirety of a future workshop on that is something that we will definitely just think about. Thank you.
Alrighty, yes, thank you. I see our next raised hand comes from Shruti. Shruti, I have allowed you to talk in the Zoom, so if you would like to go ahead and provide your comment, please do so.
Right. Thank you so much. I'm Shruti. I am a member of the public and environmental advocate. My question, I actually did post it in the chat as well, but my question is around technology strategy as we are thinking through the framework for measuring embodied carbon. So as CARB is developing its framework, like how will technology be integrated to ensure that this is a seamless, user-friendly experience for both consumers and developers? Specifically, I'm interested in hearing how open you are to, having a strategy that leverages open source platforms, API integrations, real-time data feedback loop to make it really easy for architects and developers who are using smorgasbord of software tools out there to reduce and report on these metrics, right? How is CARB going to be influencing that technology strategy, if anything? Curious to hear some perspectives on that topic. Thank you.
Thanks again. I just give a quick response to that. I really appreciate that comment. I think we are very interested in learning more about the state of practice in the industry and the types of tools that are being used. I think we are aware of several platforms out there that are being utilized to look at both embodied and operational carbon emissions. And we're very interested in learning more about the capabilities of those tools. And as well, I think as an agency, we don't have any particular interest in picking any particular tool here. But one thing we are thinking about and we want to focus on is reducing barriers and burdens for regulated entities to both comply with any reporting requirements, but as well to create and generate environmental product declarations. So I think we are working in coordination with sister agencies and EPA as well and other groups on efforts to reduce barriers and burdens to creating EPDs and working with EPD data. And so, I think we're interested if there are other tools that you feel like we should be looking at or that you'd like us to be aware of, please reach out.
Thank you.
Alrighty, thank you so much. It looks like the next hand raised here is Robert Raymer. So Robert, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself and provide your comment, we are ready for you.
Hey, thank you. This is Bob Raymer, representing the California Building Industry Association and the California Business Properties Association. And by the way, I also serve as a voting member on the Building Standards Commission's Green Building Committee. And recently, we adopted regs requiring an LCA analysis for commercial buildings over 100,000 square feet. And that number is going to drop to 50,000 square feet in January of 2026. And, looking back over the last 15 years of developing the green building standards, the approval of this, the adoption of this standard was perhaps one of the most controversial I've ever watched, and a hurdle to the implementation, is coming from the building officials. And rightfully so, as we've gone through other building standards over the decades, energy efficiency, disabled accessibility, fire safety for the wildland regions. When we're adopting new regs, there's always been a huge educational effort that the state has ginned up and helped to get the word out. And it's always helped smooth the transition from doing nothing to doing something. There's always that evolutionary period, but we've got a real hurdle here. Given those implementation dates that I just cited, there has yet to be any manner of an educational effort to the building officials of the 500 plus jurisdictions throughout the state. And so as a comment here, that needs to change, and it needs to change very quickly. As you can understand, the building officials represent the enforcement mechanism where the rubber hits the road here. And without getting them on board, we're going to continue to run into issues in terms of expanding these regulations or getting an effective implementation. So that's just simply a comment, but you were looking for hurdles, and this is one of them. We kind of need to get together, and the Building Standards Commission does have a fund. I don't know how that fund currently exists given our recent budget problems, but there is a fund that they have that is specifically for the education and training of the building official and the design community. And so you may want to check there, but these have already taken effect, and we need to get these guys educated. And that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that comment. I believe that our next raised hand belongs to, let's see, Mikhail Haramati. So Mikhail, I have just asked you to unmute yourself. So if you would like to unmute and provide that comment, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. This is Michal Harmanti from NRDC. And I just want to sort of start by saying that we're super supportive of this work and really encouraged by the research of UC Santa Barbara and just really starting to dig into the specifics around data quality for EPDs. We think it's really important that this work align with other efforts that are happening concurrently, especially the SB 596 work for cement in particular. And we know that the teams are working together closely on that. One other sort of key point of alignment is just the need for comparability with both state and federal efforts with the data that the EPA is working on in terms of regional values, and also the NRMCA for baseline data that goes into calculations of emissions reductions for cement and concrete. And then I had one kind of specific question on, which is, I guess, for Eric on the EPD developer slide for the US. I didn't see WAP, one-click LCA, or Climate Earth mentioned. And so I guess a question, those are the ones that are commonly used for the concrete and cement industry in North America. So just kind of question about whether those were intentionally left off.
Thank you so much for that comment. I will, if for questions about Professor Massenet's presentation, we will be able to direct you to ask those directly in the Q&A if you like. One quick note on the Q&A: we're seeing lots of great questions coming in via the Q&A feature. We appreciate them coming in there. We are doing our best to reply to them, or we can follow up with you afterwards if that is easier and what you're looking for. But I believe the next hand raised we have is Ryan Pessa. So if you would like to unmute Ryan and go ahead.
Hey, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. My name is Ryan Pesa. I work for a trade association that represents the wood products industry. I'm just really perplexed with this whole process. We keep looking, and on the federal level as well, to find ways to minimize the carbon emissions for extracting the raw materials for steel and concrete when you've got a perfectly great material, wood, that not only embodies carbon, but stays as a carbon sink when it's in use and can be recycled. And so I just don't understand, and I would like some clarification why CARB, can't ask the EPA because you guys are CARB, why more resources are going in to help products that contribute to acid rain, carbon emissions, when resources aren't being utilized to utilize the current products that we have, wood, that will lower carbon emissions for the installation of building materials and the use of building materials. So if you could please answer that, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Thank you for that comment. I think we are trying to look, you know, broadly across the board at building materials and investigating opportunities for decarbonization of building materials. And that can be both interventions at the industrial level as well as different types of material substitutions. But I think at this stage, this early on in our process, we're really focused on developing a framework for better understanding the GHGs emissions themselves from building materials. And so as you saw, or probably heard in our comments today, the focus at this point in our process is really at a high level on thinking about measuring and or about reporting and measurement and verification. I think as we move through this workshop process in the future, I hope you can continue to attend and give your thoughts on how we can better think about the use of wood products or how wood products are intersecting in this program development.
Our next hand raised is Mike Balanowski. So Mike, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. My timing's perfect, actually. I'd like to let Bob Raymer know. I'm here representing the American Institute of Architects. I'm an architect and was very involved in the code change that Bob Raymer mentioned that brings embodied carbon requirements to Cal Green for the first time. There are actually 3 compliance paths to clarify. One uses whole building life cycle assessment. One is focused on EPDs, very much aligned with Buy Clean. And the third is the reuse of existing buildings, which has major embodied carbon benefits that aren't as easily quantified. But I will point out to those who were listening and concerned about building officials and getting up to speed, there are 3 sources of materials already out there. One is a comprehensive guide that was produced by the Building Standards Commission with practical interpretations and guidelines for building officials and others to use those standards. AI California itself has developed a number of webinars. We developed a flow chart and checklist that shows how you can navigate between the different choices available for compliance. And the third resource is an actually great website that is exists right now and is being maintained by the Codes and Standards team, the same people who have developed and maintained the Title 24 resources funded by the utilities, and that's where there's a gathering point of all the available information about the embodied carbons. I did want to, so that's kind of sidebar, just responding to the concerns that Bob raised. The industry is well aware of the need for education, and we are addressing that and have made significant progress. More to be done, but it's not laying fallow. I did want to, in relation to these existing requirements, in the question about bottom up versus top down, first congratulate CARB on taking up this research. It's very important, and both of those approaches are going to yield valuable results, but I can see that the effort might take quite a while. And I would suggest that there is a preference for an approach to the data gathering that allows for incremental revealing of results as it comes in. And if one of those approaches makes it easier to do that, I would say there's a benefit because this is unfolding real time. As Bob Raymer mentioned, we do have code requirements now in place. Embodied carbon control is on the minds of developers and architects, not just in California, but throughout the country. So when we talk about bottom up, and you can actually illustrate case studies of particular building types and approaches to projects that have been very successful, that information getting out to the industry timely is very beneficial. But I'll also say that if we find that there are products available that allow for use within the existing code framework, for example, the reference to Buy Clean and the embodied carbon option that's in Cal Green that allows you to use EPDs to demonstrate compliance. If there are adjustments to the values that represent industry averages and other metrics that are already referenced in Cal Green, having that updated information timely is going to be important, because these are being used regularly today, not a year from now or 2 years from now or whenever the timeline is on the research. So the time element is of the essence, and I would encourage CARB to consider a mechanism for gathering information from the research in a fashion that, as soon as results are known, similar to what was done today, there were some preliminary results illustrated graphically that's very useful to the profession. If that sort of process continues, where things are put on the table as soon as you know that you have valid information, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. Just want to remind everyone, just to try and keep your comments under a couple of minutes so that we have time for everyone to give comments today. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And looks like our next raised hand belongs to Anthony Pack. So Anthony, I have set it so that you can speak if you'd like to go ahead and share your comment.
Great, thank you. This is great to see the effort that CARB's taking on this file. Yeah, just wanted to touch on a few points. I know we're going to talk later on as well in a separate meeting, but relating to your points around the top down versus bottom up, I definitely think bottom up is a better path to go. On the top down, especially if you're using dollar related figures, one of the challenges with that is that it may be that you can get a number initially more easily to get a disclosure number, but it's very hard to show reductions afterwards because it's tied to dollar spent. And it's not really that actionable for industry and at a bottom kind of at the project level. And I would definitely advise on looking at whole building LCAs as well, in addition to kind of looking at buy clean type policies. And so when you get into the whole building level, then you're looking at material quantity reductions and other strategies, other design related strategies. And I think if you can collect whole building LCAs, especially collecting the raw data from the different LCA software tools, that enables both really robust and granular benchmarking at a whole building level. And you can use that to extrapolate as you get data coming in. You can use that to extrapolate at a kind of portfolio level or across the state level. But also it enables automated quality assurance checks. If you actually collect that raw data where you have material quantities and really detailed granular submissions for each of the LCAs, that can actually help building officials later on too. So to the point that somebody else made earlier about how do we train building officials, I think one of the key things, if this is to scale, is to develop an automated way for verifying and doing quality assurance checks on all the different whole building LCA submissions that are happening to the extent that that is required. And that can both solve the benchmarking issues and also help with streamlining the processes, making sure this doesn't delay permit submissions, but also ensuring there's high quality data that are kind of verified, QA checked before it goes into benchmarking as well. And then that can then help the state also set better absolute targets, kilogram of CO2 per meter squared by different archetypes or however you want to split that, and also percent reduction targets. I can share more in future conversations, but just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that, Anthony. And I will make a brief note here that we are seeking early engagement right now for the entire thing. So if anybody would like to, reach out to us at embodiedcarbon@arb.ca.gov, that email is also on the screen right now. Please do so. We would love to hear from people right now. And I guess right now in the queue, our next hand raised belongs to Max. So Max, if you would like to go ahead and unmute, you can go ahead and share your comment.
Great, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, yeah, thanks. Appreciate the opportunity to talk here. I'm Max Puctel with AISC, the American Institute of Steel Construction. Really appreciate the opportunity to watch this, and congrats to you for all the good work you're doing. I have a question about, I was curious if someone could just articulate a bit higher level, kind of the theory of change that you're looking to accomplish with the tasks that you have at hand, specifically with the buy clean portions of what will likely be enacted. AISC has been involved with buy clean since the beginning in 2017, and we've watched a lot of these policies roll out. And I remain a little skeptical as to their actual effectiveness of getting greenhouse gas emissions out of the air, because I feel that many buy clean policies have really only served to reallocate products in the marketplace and not actually change the overall like emissions. And when you set a buy clean threshold, a limit, so to say, you're incentivizing just competition between the best performers, but you're not really incentivizing the whole industry to come along and reduce emissions. And then if an entity, say like the state of California, is then simply associating themselves with the lower products allocated to them, that can feel good on paper, but it actually is not effective in like overall industry decarbonization. So that's my criticism. I'm curious if someone can just speak a little bit to like the theory of change of how those emissions will be reduced.
Thank you for your comment.
Yeah.
Andrew, I see you want to pop in here?
Yeah, I think, oh, excellent. And maybe Pamela has something to share on this as well. That would be great. I think just we are focused today on the reporting requirements, though. And so I think, some of the questions you asked might be speaking to work that's down the road still. But Pamela, I don't know if you have some thoughts you want to share.
Yeah, not anything in detail, but I just wanted to say that obviously, thanks for highlighting that. And in our work, as we were talking about earlier in the slides, we are looking at all the policies that are out there and what how we learn from what's already out there and what gets incorporated in this particular effort. The statute does require us to reduce 40% emissions from a baseline by 2035. So there's definitely a reduction we're looking at. So again, I'm not completely maybe understanding all the things you're saying there, but that's something in terms of all the existing policies, we'll be looking closely at it, and we're happy to hear more from you on a one-on-one conversation also. So not sure if got to your exact, give you the exact answer, but just to give you some context.
Thank you for that, Pamela, as well. It looks like our next raised hand belongs to Laura Carneth. So, Laura, if you would like to go ahead and unmute and share your comment, we are ready for you.
Hi, thank you. I had a question about the top-down and bottom-up approaches to developing a baseline. So does the top-down approach talks about industry and sector output? Would that be only for materials that are manufactured in California? And the thought was that if it's only covering materials manufactured in California, it may not be covering all of the materials that are consumed by building projects in California.
Thank you.
Thanks for your question. I haven't been on the screen yet, so I'll introduce myself real quick. I'm Lex Mitchell. I'm the analysis section manager for our Embodied Carbon program. And so just so that you understand, we're looking at this point focused on materials that are used in California. So our enabling statute is Health and Safety Code 38561.3 and 0.6. And if you can't write that down so quickly, you can look in the answers section of the Q&A. I've written that down there as well for your reference. So if you have more specific questions on precisely what we're directed to do and how we're supposed to be approaching this problem, that would be a really great place to start. And then if you have very specific questions that you want to address from that, we're very happy to reach out with folks and talk sort of after the workshop and get into real nitty-gritty. And also, I'd just like to point out that we are hoping to receive your comments if you have anything that you think we should be doing, any ways you think we should be approaching it.
Thank you, Lex. It looks like our next raised hand belongs to Brian Schuster. So if you would like to go ahead and unmute Brian.
Hey everyone, thanks for a great presentation. Just curious about the relationship between, in my written comment, in California's net zero targets and other GHG emission reduction targets, and this embodied carbon initiative. Essentially, the relationship between AB 2446 and AB 43, and how CARB is treating the sort of scoping plan inventory and the 2022 scoping plan objectives and AB 1279 targets with. How those relate to embodied carbon emissions, and if there's boundaries being drawn within the embodied carbon to fall within the bounds of the scoping plan, or if they're two sort of separate efforts. Thanks.
Thank you, Brian. I will,
Nope.
let's see, for this to...
Sorry, there's a little bit of a delay between hearing the question and being able to answer it. So thanks so much for that, Brian. So as you kind of pointed out in your comment or in your question, these are two different sorts of statutory directions, and where we have our big focus on the entirety of the economy in the scoping plan. This is one of those items that drills deeper into more discrete action. So of course, I'm going to point back to what I said before of we're really trying to look closely at the statute and do what we're required to do there. At this point, we're very focused on the reporting element of that and building our data with sort of our mind to the future on how we can make sure that whatever we do post-reporting and with that high quality of data meets the statutory directions. So if that doesn't fully get at what you're hoping to understand, then let's please work together and reach out after the workshop.
And just for people over audio one more time, I will note embodied carbon at arb.ca.gov is our email address. So if you have any questions, comments, or feedback you want to direct to us after the workshop, that is where to reach us. That email is also listed on our website, which has been placed in the chat. Or I'm sorry, in the Q&A responses a few times here today, and I'm sure we'll drop it at least once more before the workshop ends. Let's see, it looks like the next hand we have up is Scott Ellert. Would you like to go ahead and share your comment?
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, and thank you for the presentation today. It's really great to get an update on all this really important work. Two questions that might be just a little downstream of where we're at today, but I think it's important for all parties involved to start thinking about how, the implications of this work once it hits the market. So I work with a company called Fabric Mass Timber. We're obviously ostensibly a beneficiary of this legislation and policy. But one thing that we hear from talking with builders and developers out there is that this is going to be another stick that drives up the cost of construction and further slows down, building projects and adds, more cost to the hard construction costs, which are already up, significantly year over year for the last, 15, 20 years. So kind of curious if there's, what kind of early consideration there is to providing carrots once this goes into the implementation phase, how that's kind of being thought of at this early kind of, as we kind of realize the formality of this. The second part of the question is, kind of coincidentally right now on another state call is the Joint Institute for Wood Products call, where they are discussing innovative wood products and state procurement policies. And there's a really big disconnect there on DGS and state procurement on using kind of low carbon and high sequestered carbon building materials in state projects. So curious if there's early consideration to how the rollout of this work with AB 2446 actually kind of aligns with, supports, coincides with updating state procurement practices, so that whether it's a wood product or a low carbon cement or recycled steel or what have you, actually gets tied to how state dollars and public projects are funded. Thank you.
Thank you. I believe that Lex is popping back in.
Hi, thanks again. Sorry again, because it always takes me a moment to click everything. This is a really great question, Scott. Thanks. I do think it's an interesting position we're in because there's so many exciting and interesting questions for us to consider that we do want to keep considering as we move forward, but we're just not in a place in this workshop to have really direct, specific responses to, because like I said, and Hanji has said, we're focused on developing the reporting and the data provisions. So once again, my primary thing that I'm going to do is offer that please reach out to us, comment, send us feedback, schedule meetings with us so that we can continue to have these discussions. I will point out that in our enabling statutes, there is provision for cost consideration. So that's something you might want to look into to sort of see what the legislature has said there. I also want to point out that we are pretty closely connected to some of our other California and other agencies and what they're doing. So we're sort of trying to understand and integrate that into this program as well. So hopefully that's a little helpful, if not as helpful as you want it to be.
Thank you, Lex, for popping in there. Our next raised hand belongs to Kathy Felkner. So Kathy, if you'd like to go ahead and unmute and share your comment, you should be able to. Kathy, if you're trying to unmute, let's see, it doesn't seem to be coming through. I just want to check in. Alrighty, hopefully that means that we have sufficiently answered whatever you were hoping to ask. So I will right now make another shout out for people to place questions they have. If you'd prefer to do it in the Q&A, you're still welcome to raise your hand. We will be still accepting those, but if not, we are going to head to the Q&A, and let's see. Andrew, is there something in the Q&A that you have flagged that you would like to talk about right away? Otherwise, I have a question up. Alrighty, we have a question in the Q&A asking how are we proposing to quantify the embodied carbon benefits of materials reuse? EPA has some grant funding that is going towards researching how to best address these materials, and perhaps we are looking at efforts to coordinate that. That was from Wes. Thank you, Wes, for that question. Let's see, is there anything that we'd like to share right now in response to that, or is that something we're looking at following up on after the workshop?
So I didn't catch, I'm sorry, I'm trying to read through the Q&A as well, but I didn't see this one. I'm trying to catch the specific material that was mentioned.
I don't believe his question referenced a specific material. It was more asking about material reuse overall.
Oh, materials reuse. Yes. Thank you. That is a really interesting question. I'm sorry to everyone on the webinar today. My answers are going to start to sound very similar and repetitive in that, these are all very important considerations that we do hope to take into account when we look at our, life cycle and analytical approach to building materials. But right now, what we have is the focus is on the reporting piece of the regulation. So this is just going to be another one that I'm hoping to follow up with folks, see your comments, and connect with you. And I keep saying connect with everyone sort of individually, but just to note, we will have more of these public engagements, and they will get more specific as we go along. So putting that out there too.
Thank you, Lex. It looks like we have another hand popping up in the for the public comment section. So David Arkin, if you would like to go ahead and unmute yourself and share your comment. you should have the ability to do so.
Great. Thank you very much for hosting this learning session and public comments. I'm an architect here in California. Served as 10 years as director of the California Straw Building Association, and some of the founding of the resurgence of straw as a construction material here in California is thanks to CARB and supporting it back in 1995. I'm also a co-chair of the American Institute of Architects 2030 commitment, where we're targeting carbon neutral buildings by the year 2030. And in that effort, we're paying greater and greater attention to embodied carbon. So this is exciting to see the coincidence of the state of California looking at this. Yesterday, the ECHO project, which is Embodied Carbon Harmonization and Optimization, released its schema, and I wanted to make sure that you all were aware of that. I'll post a link. It's echo-project.com. But the point I wanted to make and question I have is, the UN recently released a global building decarbonization report, and in it, it identified 3 steps, and the second step is a shift to bio-based materials, recognizing that as one of our best paths to storing carbon in the built environment. And just to put some scale to this, worldwide, 2.16 billion tons of grain straw are grown. And if used, it would offset all of our insulation needs, and in doing so, offset all the world's transportation impacts. So the potential is huge. And, we grow a lot of that here in California. So I guess my question is, is there a way that we can leverage carbon credits towards, and not just straw, but any building material that is shown to store carbon in buildings? Thank you.
Thanks again for that, David. That's a really interesting comment. Beyond the sort of boilerplate response that I've been giving, I'll just say that material substitutability is something that we're interested in exploring. We don't have a discrete idea of how and if we would incorporate that into a future compliance reg, but always good to start looking at things and analyzing. And so, of course, appreciate the link that you'll be sending over to the ECHO project, as well as hope you'll follow up with written comments.
And speaking of sending things via email, I do just want to take this second to remind people that all of our workshops are posted on our webpage. The link to that I've just responded to a question in the Q&A box with that link. And additionally, we have an email list. That link is also just been put in the Q&A. We have an email list which will let you know when our next public workshop and other engagement opportunities are. So if you'd like to continue engaging with us on these topics, we would love to have you sign up for those so that you can hear about them as they are released. And I'm also going to drop the embodied carbon at arb.ca.gov email as a reply right there as well, in order to make sure that everybody had that, because we would also, again, love to hear your comments even after this workshop. And you are welcome to send those in to us via that email. Also, because this question has come up multiple times, the recording for this event will also be posted at that same meetings and workshops webpage. Andrew, I see you wanted to open.
I just saw that we had a couple additional questions. At least we had one more hand. We had 2 more hands. One more hand I see that's currently up, and then we can probably close our public comment period, or maybe 2 more. We'll see. But just wanted to. I noticed Mary Selecki had her hand up here.
Yes, we do, Mary Selecki. You should be allowed to talk. So if you'd like to go ahead and unmute.
Thank you very much. Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for this first workshop. I appreciate the open collaboration that you're approaching this with and the acquisitive nature of a lot of these questions. So this is going to be a fun process to think through together. I guess the counter question I have, and I'll put this in a comment letter as well, but when you were describing the two approaches to the baseline, when I was reviewing the statutory guidelines, I think what occurred to me was a different approach, which was perhaps more akin to the initial years of the low carbon fuels standard over at the Air Resources Board, where after the equivalent of EPDs were submitted, then reporting parties, in that case, it was oil and gas manufacturers and refiners, would reported for a couple of years. In this case, it would be the developers. And the data from the first couple of years of that reporting was the information that was utilized to establish that baseline. So I'm just curious if that was an approach that you all considered, or if that's still like an open-ended question. And Lex, that's probably where you'll insert your standard answer so far.
Yeah, so thank you, Mary. That's really great. Of course, I've got my standard answer. Looking back at the enabling statute, Health and Safety Code 38561.3, and Section B talks about the baseline. And all it says there really is that it should be based on EPDs or other information for 2026, which is something we've been thinking about. How do we get through that? How do we do something that's either 2026 or up to date, or maybe both? So a lot of thought has gone into that. We're not ready, I don't think, to give the exact specifics on that, but we have definitely thought through how do we do that in a forward-looking way, and put some thought to how do we, once we have this data come in, sort of also use that to ground truth it, if you will. So those are both approaches that are on our minds, and we look forward to seeing what else you have to say in your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you, Lex, for your response. I'm sorry, Hunter, were you trying to hop in?
And no, we just have a couple more slides for next steps, and that's it. So if we're concluding comments.
Cool, that does seem to be all of our public comment. So again, you can feel free to go ahead and drop any further comments and questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. But other than that, it seems like we're ready to pass it back off to Hunter.
Yeah, I just want to quickly mention that we reiterate the need for like public engagement while seeking early engagement from everyone, like all industry partners, as we're developing our initial reporting tool. So we're really hoping to collect all sorts of like EPD data, whole building life cycle data, and all those data that will really help CARB to develop the process and answer all your questions later. I just want to reiterate that. Please send comments back to us. Thank you.
Absolutely. As I mentioned, just a few next steps here to discuss, as we discussed today throughout, really appreciate the feedback and engagement today from folks on the call. If we can move to the next slide. As I mentioned, today is just the first event in a series of workshops that we will be leading to discuss the agency's work on decarbonizing building materials. We're planning or aiming to hold quarterly workshops on various elements of rule development and invite public feedback on potential content or agenda items for future workshops. So please, today, we heard a few thoughts, but if you're interested in discussing or making suggestions for future workshop content, feel free to reach out to us by email. Staff will release more information on planned workshops in the near future. Hopefully we'll have these scheduled as soon as possible. And staff aim to develop and solicit input on draft regulatory concepts throughout early 2025. And by that, I am referring specifically to our reporting and fee requirements. We anticipate bringing a final reporting, a fee, and baseline requirements for consideration by CARB's board in late 2025. So we have one more poll today that we'd like for folks to take part in. Once again, simply scan the QR code or text your response to the number you see on the screen. And really just two simple questions here about whether you are, how interested you are in continuing to attend these workshops, and are you already subscribed to our email list? We do have a GovDelivery email list for Embodied Carbon, through which we will be sending updates and disseminating other materials. And so if you'd like to stay informed, please do subscribe to that list. Let's see. Lovely. Oh. Well, hopefully lots of positivity here as we move forward. And great. Okay, let's moving forward to the next slide. Awesome. Okay, as we expected, lots of folks today on the call who are not currently subscribed to our list. So please, if you can, subscribe to the GovDelivery list. Makes it so that we can make sure that we notify everyone when we're going to be conducting these types of workshops and releasing information in the future. Next slide, please. So we will aim to have a public comment docket open. Apologies, I believe that the docket is currently not open, but you should be able to submit public comments to that docket. There is, well, as we mentioned, please subscribe to the listserv here, linked on the slide, which you can also find on our website as well. And that's our Embodied Carbon email address. We're going to be answering a few of the questions in the Q&A. And so we won't be ending the meeting right now. We're going to continue to respond to some of the questions in the Q&A and provide some direct responses to those questions.
Sorry, that's why I was jumping on that we still have time, so maybe we can answer some of the questions. We may not get to all of them, but at least we can try to get to some of them since we still have time. But the ones that we are not able to get to, please, again, feel free to reach out to us via email. So back to you, whoever is taking on those questions.
I can go ahead and read some more out. We had an anonymous attendee ask, will the PCRs be standardized across program operator?
Anji, do you want to answer? I feel like you know
think
most about PCRs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. Obviously, there are multiple operators who currently originate the development of PCRs, and we're aware that there are differences in the approaches that different program operators take to PCR generation. I think, we are really interested in engaging in the PCR development process and so that we can help provide technical assistance. We also are engaged with the work at the Environmental Protection Agency on PCR criteria standardization and data quality improvements. We're following that work very closely. And so I think, we are interested, we are still in the process of really developing our approach to thinking about PCRs and EPDs. But we will be looking to be more engaged in PCR development, definitely across different program operators.
Thank you, Andra. Our next question is on maintenance, specifically how would maintenance of the product impact the environmental impact of the material?
This is just so great. So many of these questions coming in are questions that we've sort of been punting around ourselves. Of course, I've got the boilerplate that we don't have a specific answer for how that will play a role in this, because that's sort of more of the next stage of compliance development. For now, we're hoping to get the reporting phase done, and we will continue to look at whether and how maintenance is included in the life cycle analysis.
Thank you, Lex. Our next question is on EPDs. Specifically, at what point of a project would EPDs be required for collection?
I think this is a great question and one we would be very interested in hearing your feedback on. We're very interested in better understanding the points in the building development lifecycle at which it's most, at which data is available and reporting burdens are minimized. So while we expect that we would receive, there would be a need to report EPDs for building materials, and we'd also like to be able to tie those together to materials that are placed into buildings. I think it's still an open question about at what points in the building chain or exactly who the reporting entities would be. Suffice to say, though, I think that we would be interested in learning more about the ability of or about the capabilities of using EPDs to establish chain of custody of building materials.
Thank you, Andra. It seems that the next question we have here is on standardization from Karen Lee. In addition to the standardization of the PCR and EPDs, the standardization of what elements and the level of detail are required would be helpful. Do we have a response to what level of standardization maybe we're imagining?
Once again, I think these are great questions and details that I think we're going to be looking to work out more through our public process here. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about what components should be included in an EPD and about how PCRs are originated. And so I think this is going to be a conversation that we're very excited to have and get your input on. Yeah, I think that this is there's a lot of conversation to unpack there about standardization of PCRs. So we appreciate that.
Thank you, Anji. Our next question is back to EPDs real quick. What are the requirements to be a certification body or VVB to validate EPD?
EPDs are generated generally by a third-party entity, which will produce the life cycle assessment and a verification. So there are some bodies out there which do some verification work, but I think it's a really good question. I think when we talk about the specifics of our program, what kind of requirements will be in place with respect to EPD validation. So I think that's something that we haven't quite worked out yet.
Awesome. Thank you, Anji. It looks like our next question is more in the tune of architects and structural engineers in their role. The question is, what are good sources of information that architects and structural engineers may use in early design aiming towards best practice design?
I can take that one, Alex. I think there's a wide variety of resources out there for best practices, and it really depends on kind of the building scale and the project type and things like that. But I would say a good starting point is just to identify the GWP thresholds that are set by the building codes right now, both for Cal Green and by Clean California Act, and then use those as a starting point. With that in mind, then you can also start referencing different EPD databases that are freely available to start looking at the different products that are available in each of these material categories. So that'll give you a good idea of what the requirements are, what are the kind of products available, and what you can source for your project to start reducing the overall embodied carbon for the project.
Thank you, Aditi. Our next question is from Monica, and I believe that we're going to have Lex hop in and take this one.
Okay, sorry. So yeah, the building LCA responsibility in CalGreen lies on the designers and architects for the most part. I saw here that the developer and builder is listed as the reporting party. What is the intent of the different approaches? So Monica, I would just point you back to Health and Safety Code 38561.3 under C for the framework. It talks about submission of information by entities undertaking the construction of a project. And it also talks about manufacturers of building materials. So from the statute, those are sort of two of the main places that we expect to receive information from. So hopefully that helped out.
And a very similar question, I'm going to just elaborate on to follow up on that, I believe, is are architecture firms we requested to report, or who else is included under the developers and builder?
Yeah, so, you know, once again, we're following the statutory direction, but we still haven't reached like the very, very specific level details. So exactly who'd be required to report and what exactly they'd be required to report, we're still sort of figuring out.
Thank you. Hopping back to the topic of EPDs, a very, very popular topic of questions here today. We had somebody ask, will industry-wide EPDs be accepted and used, or only company/product-specific EPD data be accepted?
I think I can take that one. So facility-specific EPD definitely gives us the most information. That's what we're hoping to collect, like in our voluntary data sharing phase. But we understand it can be challenging to produce some of EPD, especially for small business and facilities. So we're working through the process when will industry-wide EPD be acceptable. So please work with us during this process and help us collect all the data and develop the process.
Thank you, Leon. Our next question is on LEED standards, and it says, LEED green building programs already have a methodology to evaluate the project using LCCAs and LCA. They have to put together a structure to address many of the goals CARB is trying to address. Is there any possibility of speaking with them to see if they would be willing to share methodology and data to help advance this effort in any way?
Yes, thank you, Michael. I think that's a great point. We are working with USGBC in just kind of understanding the way that they have been tracking the data for all of their projects, and kind of also a big part of our work would also involve just understanding kind of a little bit more detail and more specifics for where the information for the data requirement for LEED comes from versus what our statute requires. So we are coordinating with them, still learning from their process, still kind of figuring out our process. So they are on our radar, don't worry about it. We do appreciate that there's a lot of education that's come through the LEED projects. So we're hoping to harness that in our work as well.
Thank you, Aditi, for that response. And that question was from Michael Smith. Thank you, Michael, for submitting the question. Let's see, I think our next question up is from Alan. Alan asks, I often hear that low carbon materials have to be adopted by Caltrans before we in the construction industry can use lower carbon alternatives. Is Caltrans on board with the 2035 goal?
Thanks for that, Alan. This is sort of an interestingly phrased question because the goal that we have is established by the legislature in statute, which As we all understand, the legislature is sort of superior and directing to regulatory agencies. But we are working with our other regulatory agencies to make sure that whatever hurdles there are or whatever coordination needs to be done, that we're doing that. So hopefully that's helpful to you. As far as the use of the materials by the construction industry requiring Caltrans approval, I think that's something you'll have to reach out directly to Caltrans to get discrete answers on.
Thank you, Lex, for popping in there. Our next question is on construction methods, specifically how the construction method, for example, modular versus conventional construction, can impact carbon emission reduction.
I think we answered that initially. I think they had their hand raised, right?
Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I forgot to mark that down.
No worries.
I believe, let's see, I believe our next question is on, again, something that I think we may have heard before, wood products, specifically how we are integrating and informing our work with other public works procurement projects.
Yeah, I can just say that we, as I've said before, we've been working with our sister agencies, our sibling agencies, and wood products is one specifically, and that we've been reaching out to Border Forestry and others, CAL FIRE. So we are integrating as sort of as well as we can within the timelines. It's unfortunate that today we ended up with two things scheduled at the same time. That wasn't intentional. But that is definitely something we're coordinating with our other agencies on.
Thank you. And Hanji, you want to hop in as well?
I was just going to mention that we are, taking a step back from just wood products, we are meeting continually with folks from the Department of Government Services and folks who administer the Buy Clean program for California's Buy Clean Act. And so I think, obviously we're hoping to help inform those programs and support those programs in any way we can.
Thank you, Andra. Our next question is from Kylie Fager in the chat, and she asks, how will the baseline set a GHG target for individual buildings, for example, a target normalized by floor area in kilograms CO2 equivalent per square meter, or set a GHG baseline at the industrial scale?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I feel like there's a lot of depth to, there's multiple questions within here. So, the statutory direction is to set a baseline against which to measure the total emissions in the space, in the industrial, residential, commercial, et cetera, space. And that would be a baseline against which our progress toward the 2035 target would be met, I think, is the sort of initial read that we have. There's a question you had about, it looks like a question about units. So there's a, as detailed as that gets, there is some guidance in Health and Safety Code 38561.6 about the units types. Hopefully that helps answer your question.
Thank you, Lex, for popping in on that one. And our next question is asking if we can speak to the role of building deconstruction in our data research. While more costly, it is an opportunity to reuse and better recycle building materials. This one coming from Veronica Pardo. Thank you, Veronica, for the question.
Yeah, I think we're very interested in opportunities for material reuse and recycling, and obviously in investigating in when those can reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The focus of the, if you look at the enabling statutes for this program, though, the focus of the work is going to be on new construction as well. So there's certain covered projects which are included in the scope of the regulation, in addition to building materials. So I think we're interested in looking broadly at the life cycle of building materials and opportunities for reuse as well.
Thank you, Andro, for hopping in there. I'm going to double check for raised hands one more time. Okay, we don't have any. I will note that the Q&A, we are working through the Q&A. I'm not sure that we'll be able to answer all of the questions you have in there, but we are going to keep doing our best. Our next question is EPA has recently introduced several grants to aid manufacturers to make EPD. Is there a plan to introduce state-level grants in California too?
Yeah, so just to address this from CARB's perspective, we don't have any current grants that we're planning to do. I believe there are other agencies within California that have put out funding around that. I don't know if Hanji, if you remember if there are any, but it wouldn't come from CARB at this time.
I'm not aware of any currently open funding calls.
Thank you, Andro and Lex, for those responses. Our next question is from Bruce Ernst, and he asks, are there any thoughts to adding HVAC systems to the construction section of building? The ongoing operational carbon of HVAC is clearer because of the energy consumption. However, HVAC systems containing fluorinated refrigerants would bring large amounts of climate forcers into the construction infrastructure of the building.
Yeah, this is a question that's pretty explicitly about like a compliance program design more so than data. So unfortunately, we just really don't have an answer around how we would do that right now.
Thank you, Lex, for hopping in on that one. Another question on EPD and specifically EPD reporting. Will CARB establish certification/registration of third-party EPD verifiers like it did for AB 32 reporting requirement?
I'm not sure about the crossover comparison piece, but I think I think it's one thing we're interested in thinking more about is the process and pathways for EPD generation and the EPDs that we would accept as reporting materials in this program. And so I think we're aware of the fact that there are currently the state of practice for EPDs is generally third parties that are producing these for firms. And so I think we're interested in learning more about what that value chain looks like. And then I think we could probably discuss more about the needs for certification or registration of firms producing them. I think at this point, we're trying to better understand the limitations and the strengths and weaknesses of the EPDs themselves, as well as the scope of EPD availability. And I think that's primarily what we're focused on at this moment.
Thank you, Andro, for that input. Let's see. We have another question on the scale of policy interventions. The question is, what scale of policy intervention do you imagine the resulting regulations taking? For example, at the material scale, such as buy clean, component scale, or building scale, such as setting a GWT target per floor area.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kylie. Once again, I'm going to point you toward the enabling statutes of Health and Safety Code 38561.3 and .6. So there are multiple references within there to building materials and to projects. And there's also reference to, in point 6 specifically, looking at GWP per floor area and those kinds of things. So those are all things to potentially be considered. Yeah.
Thank you, Lex. Our next question seems to be a bit of a comment and related question. Given the focus on EPDs as one of the main reporting tools / approaches, will CARB consider having an approach for new and emerging tech that offer potentially substantial emissions reductions but lack the required 1 full year of continuous production data to develop an EPD, 6 months for an interim EPD? Oftentimes, these new developers / manufacturers lack sufficient demand from the market to continuously manufacture product for 1 year or even 6 months. This poses a major barrier for new / emerging tech. It would be great to see if CARB and Professor Mastinet can devise an approach to accommodate this pipeline of new tech, because oftentimes these will likely result in the least amount of newly created emissions from building materials like cement / concrete. Thank you, Pavitra, for this question. I will actually pop in and note that we are happy to help direct questions about Professor Massinet's research specifically to Professor Mastinet, as well as seeing what we can answer here. But yeah, we're happy to help direct questions about the research specifically on it.
And just to add on, I'll just say we would like to learn more about of course, we do encourage new technologies and want to better understand, what the data gaps may be. So yeah, definitely open to hear more about it and how we can factor those things in there.
Thank you, Pamela. Our next question is again on EPDs, this one asking, are there any good examples of EPDs that may be the same end material but address the challenge that the source materials vary regionally, both in their contributing footprinting and their material property?
I think that's a bit of a very detailed question for us, but I can just maybe point you towards some materials or information that might be interesting. Is that we are, as mentioned before, very in coordination or in communication with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency on their work, developing criteria for standardizing product category rules and improving data for EPDs. And so I might point you to some of that work that we are also looking at as we start to think about different criteria for EPDs, as far as what should be included as far as data practice. And the EPA is developing a labeling program for EPDs through their PCR criteria review. And I think that's some work that we are very interested in following. And so hopefully that can help answer some of that question.
Thank you, Andro, for popping in on that one there. Our next question is on LCA approaches. Specifically is, how will CARB account for full LCA carbon impacts for materials such as mass timber identified in the 2023 World Resources Institute analysis? How will LCAs and EPDs be verified by CARB?
Yeah, this is another question where I'm unfortunately going to have to go back to the boilerplate. We understand that doing an LCA for these types of materials is very potentially complex, but we haven't gotten far enough into the process to have the specifics about how exactly we would approach that. If you have specific recommendations, or if anyone does, on how you would recommend we do that, please reach out to us. On the second part of the question about verification, sort of the same answer. We're also recognizing, the interest in that part of the program, but we're going to have to defer to later workshops to address specifics around that.
Thank you so much, Lex. And thank you, Lex, Andrew, Aditi, Pamela, and Leong, for hopping in and answering these great questions. Thank you to everybody who submitted questions. For doing so, we would love to continue hearing your feedback and your questions at our email, again, embodiedcarbon@arb.ca.gov. I believe that concludes the questions that we have going pending in the Zoom Q&A. So I'm going to pass back to Andrew for some final words. Oh, no, I'm sorry, I missed one. It seems there is a question somewhere in the Q&A here. Lex, would you actually like to pop in and take this one?
Yeah, I think there's maybe something about Zoom where we're not seeing all of the same questions, because I still see a few. I think we've only got a couple of more minutes left in the workshop, so we'll try to power through. So I'll start with some of the easier ones. Let's see, comment. So there's a Rich Blaustein says he has a fanciful question. Has there been any examination, perhaps just theory, on using the built environment to add albedo as well as carbon retention? Once again, just sort of having to go back to primarily the boilerplate response of aware of both of those as potential carbon mitigation strategies. Of course, they'd have to be resolved, examined on their merits, but we're not ready to get into the specifics of whether they'll be part of this program today. Let's see. Maybe there's only one question left that I see. The rest look like comments. So this is from Michael Smith. So huge question. I'm going to paraphrase because there's quite a lot here, but essentially he's asking about developers wondering whether they should start doing carbon mitigating actions now and risk having a change to the baseline that punishes early adopters. And so the bottom line, essentially, do we have a plan to approach baselines without punishing the early adopters and those that have been trying to achieve their own goals ahead of what California is trying to push them to do? So that's certainly something we've talked about. I think exactly how we devise the baseline has yet to be fully discussed, externally. But it's certainly something that we've talked about, whether there are shifting baselines or things like that. I will once again point you to the statute, Health and Safety Code 38561.3. When it talks about the baseline, it talks about the year 2026 specifically, and data from that year or best available data. So we have some guidance in the statute on how to work through that, but it remains to be seen the specifics of how we do that. It's probably the last time I'm going to speak in this workshop, so thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm going to hand it back to the other folks.
I believe that does actually conclude all of the questions in the chat. Thank you so much. I will pass it on back to Hanji.
Well, thanks everyone who attended today. We really enjoyed or really appreciated the feedback. And as I said, this is just the first of our workshop series. So we really appreciate the opportunity for continued dialogue. I just want to reiterate, we really are genuinely looking for engagement with folks. So please, we hope you'll reach out to us. We're very much interested in trying to work with folks on potentially voluntary data sharing as we develop our reporting requirements. So for folks who are on the call today or attendees who might know other interested parties, please try to get the word out. It's really a great opportunity to engage with us now to ensure that the reporting requirements that we design look as close to or as similar to current data gathering practices as possible. And so really to reduce burdens there in the future. As I said, I really appreciate everybody's time today. And, I thank all of our CARB team on the call too for this workshop as well.
I was just going to add to your statement, Hanjiro, that we may not have had all the answers to your questions, but we're really excited to hear a lot of the engagement and interest and all the questions, good questions. So definitely, please reach out, send us your comments, and we want to work with you to help answer some of these questions. So that's the intent here for this first workshop. Thanks, everybody.
Yes, thank you everyone for your time and your feedback. Really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, everyone.